So the probability of dying is definitely not something that we want to have to think about on a regular basis. But there are people whose job is to consider the probability that any individual would die. Think about if you have purchased a life insurance policy. Okay, so if you haven't, basically a life insurance policy is going to pay out a particular amount of money if you were to die while you have that policy. So most people who have a family or are young tend to carry a life insurance policy, and it tends not to be terribly expensive because the probability that somebody who's 20 to 24 really is not, it's not a high probability that they would die. So these costs for somebody at that age range, really it's not that expensive to have life insurance because the likelihood that you'll actually draw that life insurance is really, really low. Now, as you get older, life insurance becomes much more expensive because the probability that somebody in their 50s dying is much higher than somebody in their 20s. When you get into the 80s, that's even more common. So that's somebody's job, is to understand what these different probabilities are. But we can look at some results from 2013, and we see that the proportion of men who die in any given year is 0.0012, and the proportion of women is 0.0004. So if you are the insurance company, then that tells you that you will have to pay out for a man 0.12% in that age group versus 0.04% for the women's group. And so because of that, the insurance company is probably going to charge men more because they're more likely to have to pay out. Another place that you might see this more directly is car insurance. If you've had a wreck, you probably have seen that your car insurance went up. Well, why did they penalize you for that? Well, they have found that people who have had one wreck are probably more likely to have a second or a third wreck. And so the likelihood of them having to pay out again is higher. And so you're at more risk of having an accident, which means you're at more risk of the car company having to pay for you. And I had a little fender bender that was like at no miles an hour and still managed to do $4,000 of damage on my car and several thousand dollars of damage in the other car. And that was like for nothing. So I certainly had not paid $4,000 that year into my car insurance payment. So the insurance company did lose some money on me that particular year. Now, all of the other years, they have not had to pay anything, so it ends up evening out. But those are the kinds of things that insurance people have to worry about. What's the likelihood that they'll have to pay out their policy? One other application is college students tend to be less expensive to insure. Insurance companies allowing children to stay on with their parents until 26 really doesn't cost them a whole lot extra because people from the age of 18 to 26 really don't have nearly the amount of expenses that older people would have, or even maybe younger, children, babies, that sort of age. And so keeping up with these kinds of things, what are the relative risks? That's what we're looking at when we're talking about probability. So we do want to consider a few myths about probability, because probability, the only thing that it answers is what would happen if we did this many, many times. But the typical American doesn't understand probability in this way. So one of the things that people have trouble with is this myth of short-run regularity. Probability says that randomness is regular in the long run. But our intuition about randomness tends to tell us that random phenomena should also be regular in the short run. And when they're not, we often will look for some explanation other than chance variation. Look at these coin flips. We're just flipping 6 coins, and I'll go ahead and tell you the probability of any of these is exactly the same, which is absolutely crazy based on what we have intuitively, our understanding about, flipping coins, but these are all just as probable as anything else. So this idea that we want to see regularity in the short run, that's a myth. It's not true, but it's something that we as humans just really want to have that order in our life. We also see things like this where people are so obsessed when they see a coincidence. And the thing is about coincidences is you pay attention when something is lines up, but you ignore it when it doesn't. So take this example. In 2006, Ohio State beat Michigan by a score of 42-39. The Pick 4 lottery numbers that day were 4239, and people thought it was such a coincidence. Like, oh, what is going on? The lottery is based on the score today. Well, it was that day, but think about all of the other days that it wasn't. Okay, these numbers, you had 10,000 possible numbers that the Ohio lottery could have picked. And so on this particular day, they happened to line up. But I want you to think, even on this particular day, let's think about all the other schools that had a football game. There's 32 NFL teams, 135 Division I football teams, 150 Division II teams, 231 Division III teams, and over 25,000 high school teams. All of them play games throughout the season. There's 38 states that have one of these Pick 3 or Pick 4 lottery games, and often they draw multiple times a week. So there's a lot of opportunities for us to have matched a football game score with one of these lotteries. It just happened to be in Ohio that day, but think about all of the games that they didn't line up for. So sometimes these coincidences aren't really as, they're not necessarily as coincidental as we think. So another thing is looking at the lottery. Sometimes people win more than once, and you think winning the lottery is such an uncommon thing, like to win it more than once is, absolutely impossible. But in 1986, there's a woman in New Jersey who won twice. So she had won $3.9 million, then won another $1.5. The New York Times, after this happened, claimed that the odds of one person winning the big prize twice was about 1 in 17 trillion. However, some statistics professors wrote a rebuttal about this, and they said that really it's not going to be quite as uncommon as you think. So yes, the chance of winning twice is tiny, but it's almost certain that someone among the millions of regular lottery players in the United States would win 2 jackpot prizes. Okay, so yes, if you go and play, the chances of you winning is really low. But if we think of all the millions of people who play regularly, eventually one of them is going to win twice. And the statisticians figured out the odds were actually probably a double winner would happen sometime within the next 7 years. And it turns out that it just took 2 years and someone else won twice. So, this whole idea of things we think being uncommon, yes, they would if we're just looking in the short term. If we're just looking at one individual, absolutely. But when you think collectively and you start looking at things in the long run, then we start seeing that some of these patterns are not quite as uncommon as we might assume.